This is the first in a series of webinars we will be presenting on assessment of memory, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for the other webinars in that series. I will share toward the end of our session today the next webinar upcoming in our series. I am Dr. Gloria Maccow. I am a licensed psychologist by background, a school psychologist. And this topic is of special interest to me because for a number of years, I worked in the schools working with young children, trying to understand why they were struggling with learning in the classroom. So it's of interest to me from that perspective, but it's also of interest to me because I've come to realize as I've gotten a little older that probably if I have to think about my life's work, I think about one of my graduate students who shared with me some information about children, who reminded me that children are always the only future the human race has. And it is our responsibility as adults to teach them well. And one of the ways that we can teach them well is to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And that is where the assessment comes in. I work, as Sherry mentioned, for Pearson Clinical Assessment. So in terms of disclosures, I must let you know that the sponsor of this webinar, Pearson Clinical Assessment, is my employer. I have no relevant non-financial information to disclose. I also should let you know that Pearson Clinical Assessment is the publisher of several of the assessments that I will reference during the presentation. By the end of our time together today, you should be able to describe the process of learning and remembering. We'll talk about that as a process. I want to talk about some, or at least refer you to some commonly used assessments of memory. And then finally, I want to conclude by looking at some sample data from the RAML-3, the Wide Range Assessment of Memory and Learning, the third edition. And I'm going to use some sample data to describe the memory strengths and weaknesses of a 14-year-old student. So to get us started then, maybe you are familiar with some of these students I'm going to describe. Maybe a student who frequently asks for repetition of directions. Do you know a student who takes a long time to answer orally presented math questions? I remember when I was in classrooms and we would ask these word problems, it was always a challenge to see who would be able to raise their hand the fastest and provide the correct answer. Do you know a student who forgets what she is doing in the middle of the task? Or how about a student who forgets to turn in homework? The question is, why do some students remember information immediately after they hear it and maybe not the following day? How often do you hear teachers say, he knew that on Friday when he left here, now he's back on Monday and he seems to have forgotten that information? Why do some students struggle with mental math? Those are the kinds of questions that we'd like to answer during our webinar today. And we want to start that by thinking about learning and remembering as a process and to think about that process. Because whenever you think about a process, you think about the possibility of a breakdown occurring at some point along that process, along that continuum. So to get us to start thinking about that process, I want to think about the concepts that are the focus of our session today, memory and learning. And those two concepts are closely linked. Why? Because memory is the natural outcome of learning. If I have learned or I have acquired information, then I should be able to demonstrate that by retrieving that information from long-term storage on command. When you ask me a question, for example, if you ask me, well, what is the population of the United States? Maybe I learned that at some point. I have to then go and search my memory to try to retrieve that information information. So memory is the persistence of learning in a state that can be revealed at a later time. And that is information that was described by Squire in 1987. In other words, we're thinking about memory as the indicator that learning has previously occurred, right? So when you think about memory and learning, we think about those as two processes that are highly connected. So when students are learning information, we want them to learn and remember the information. The process begins by them encoding or registering the information, whether the information comes in through the eye or through the ear or through another sense. You're starting with a registration of information that then is held in short-term memory and that I can hold there for longer periods if I do something actively to retain it there. For example, if I rehearse that information, I can hold it in my short-term memory. And I want to hold it in my short-term memory until a permanent memory trace is created in long-term memory. And once that permanent memory trace is created in long-term memory, it can stay there for a long period of time, indefinitely, if you will. And then on command, I can retrieve that information in order to answer questions, in order to solve problems, in order to understand why I should fly into a certain airport if I'm going to a small town in Illinois, for example. So again, you're thinking about the registration, the short-term memory, the long-term memory, and the retrieval. And we'll talk about these in detail because when you think about the process of memory, you're thinking about starting with the encoding and then culminating theoretically with the retrieval. So when you think about the encoding part of the process, you think about the external information coming in from the environment, whether it's coming in through my eye, my ear, one of the other senses. That external information is transformed into images or mental representations. Those are memories that are then stored in short-term memory. So when you think about the encoding, the information is held in short-term memory. And what I want the biological process then is for that information from immediate memory to be solidified into long-term memory stores. And then on command for that information to be brought back into conscious awareness so that I can act upon it, right? I can use it as needed. So different researchers talk about the process of learning and use different terms. Like one of the books I'm going to be referencing throughout our presentation today is really Essentials of School Neuropsychological Assessment by Dr. Dan Miller. And Dr. Miller talks about the process of learning as beginning with the collection of information, the sorting of information, the storing of information, the retrieval of information. Dr. Colin Elliott, who's the author of the Differential Ability Scales, uses different terminology, but effectively you're thinking about that same process. How do I receive the information? How do I perceive or make sense of the information? How do I process it? How do I decide? How do I store it? And then how do I remember it? So even though the terminology might be different, you're thinking about a process that begins with the collection or the registration or the encoding, and then culminates with that remembering or retrieval. So again, referencing Dr. Miller's work, Essentials of School Neuropsychological Assessment, we're going to be talking today about memory and learning, right? But when you think about learning in general, you think about the multiple cognitive factors that are integrated when we are learning information, starting at the foundation looking at sensory motor functions, where again, the sensory being involved in the collection of the information. I need to pay attention to the information in order for it to enter my short-term store. Some of the information that comes in is visual spatial, some is going to be language. So all of these, if you look here at this image, you could see that all four sensory motor functions, attentional processes, visual spatial processes, and language processes are all involved in memory and learning. But so is the speed and efficiency of cognitive processing. How quickly can I learn and remember information? Rapid automatic naming tasks, for example. And then you think about overall cognitive functioning at the apex. You always think about psychometric G as the ability to engage in complex mental processing that might involve the transformation of information. But today we're going to be focusing on memory and learning processes, and we want to think about how the sensory memory component is involved, how the attention and concentration could impact my ability to learn and remember, whether maybe I am able to learn and remember more effectively language-based information compared to visual spatial information. Those are the concepts that we want to focus on today. So before I get to some data, I want to think through some theories of memory and learning and think about what we know theoretically about learning and remembering. So I want to start out by talking about Atkinson's and Shiffrin's 1968 Modal model of memory that is a classic model of memory, where Atkinson and Shiffrin posit that memory is made up of a series of stores. You're thinking about a sensory memory store, a short-term memory store, and a long-term memory store. And the modal model of memory is also referred to as the multi-store model of memory based on these different stores. And each store is based on the capacity, on how much information is stored. It's also based on the coding or the registration. What is stored? Am I storing information that is language-based? Am I storing information that is visual spatial? And then also how long information is stored. So capacity, coding, and duration are all important when we think about these three memory stores. Another concept that I want to talk about with respect to the modal model of memory is the dual process model. And this is based on research by Charles Brainerd and Valerie Reina, their fuzzy trace theory of memory and reasoning. And they posit that people have two memory representations, verbatim and gist. And you could think about just conceptually what these might refer to. Verbatim would be I'm remembering the surface information. Effectively, I'm remembering the words in a sentence, for example. And the gist would be focused on semantics. I am remembering the meaning. And so when you think about the dual process model, their theory is that we encode, we store, retrieve, and we forget the information in these two traces of memory separately and completely independently of each other. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in reading this research, fuzzy trace theory, is that the contention is that as we mature, we increasingly rely on gist information over verbatim information. And I think it makes sense, right? If I can focus on the meaning, for example, if you tell me a story about a man who was robbed on the streets of maybe whatever the city was, and then the man went to the police station that was right down the street to make a report, I may not necessarily remember where, in what city, in what state, but I may remember that it was a man and he was robbed. So you think about the meaning. And one of the things that we know about memory is that you really can remember more effectively information that is meaningful. So if you think about those three, you think about the three types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term, in terms of capacity, coding, and duration. Certainly sensory memory, there's a lot of information that's around you right now. So when you think about sensory memory, it's really what you continue to hear, to see after that information is gone. But sensory memory comes in through your senses, has a high capacity for information, has a high capacity for information. So there is a lot of sensory memory around us, but the duration, how long is it retained? At most milliseconds, right? At most several seconds. The way that the information is registered is through the senses, whether you're thinking about visual or iconic memory, or going into an iconic store maybe, or verbal memory, or echoic memory, referred to as echoic memory. So again, think about each of these in terms of capacity, coding, and duration. Short-term, so sensory memory, when we talk about sensory memory, we often give a classic example of that cocktail party effect, where if I'm at a party and I'm talking to somebody and there are people all around me talking, there's a lot of information coming in through my senses, but I'm not really paying attention to it. But then all of a sudden I hear somebody over in the corner mention my name and I perk up, I pay attention, I engage my attentional resources, and then all of a sudden I am focused on what that person is saying about me. So there's a lot of sensory information around us, but whether or not it enters our short-term memory store really depends on the attention that we allocate to it. So short-term memory, really, you're thinking about sensory memory that has a high capacity and a short duration. Short-term memory has a limited capacity, but a long duration if I continually rehearse, right? So information can stay in my short-term memory for a long time if I rehearse it. So for example, if you call me up and you give me a phone number, I don't have a paper and pen to write it down. I'm going to say it over and over, rehearse it, and then I can let it go once I get to paper and pencil and I write it down. So when you think about adults, for example, we often think about short-term memory in terms of capacity. How many bits of information can we hold in our short-term memory? And for adults, we say 7 plus or minus 2. Whether we refer to this as capacity, sometimes we refer to it as memory span. For adults, you're thinking about that number 7 theory. Now, if you're working with a 4-year-old, their capacity is going to be lower, right? So you're working with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, how many bits of information can they hold in their short-term memory? Fewer, maybe a 4-year-old, 4 bits of information, for example. The way that we code information in short-term memory is mainly auditory. So for example, I always use this example where I show a picture of a cat and I ask people to write down what they see. And inevitably what they write down is they write down C-A-T, because effectively, even though the information, the initial registration was through the eye, the actual processing of that visual image was through Baddeley's phonological loop. So we automatically recode visual information to sounds. And that is typically when you think about coding in short-term memory, we're more often than not, we're coding auditory information. So unless I rehearse, information will stay in short-term memory for less than a minute, but I can work actively to hold it there. And one way to do that is by rehearsing. And then certainly the long-term store, the capacity is unlimited. And the information that we tend to register and store tends to be mainly semantic, whether visual or auditory. And that information theoretically will last a lifetime, days, months, and years. And sometimes there will need to be a cue. Like I remember a few years ago, I was trying to remember the name of somebody with whom I worked in Kentucky. And for the life of me, I couldn't retrieve the name from long-term memory. Then all of a sudden, somebody called me up from the University of Kentucky, and it was as if a light bulb flashed. And all of a sudden, I was able to retrieve the name of that gentleman to say, oh, do you work with so-and-so? So again, information in long-term stores is going to be held there indefinitely. Okay, so I want you to experience learning and remembering. Just a brief task here. And I'm going to show you something on the next screen. So I want you to just pull out a piece of paper. I want you to look at the information on the next screen. I'm going to expose it for 3 seconds. And I want you to look at it until it disappears. And after the information is removed, I'd like you to write down what you saw. You ready? Okay, write down what you saw. All right. So I asked you to learn and remember some information. And then I asked you to show that you learned and remember the information by writing it down. So I think about the input demand of that particular task, and I think about the output demand of that particular task. But I want to do something a little different here, okay? So now you have written down what you learned and remembered, and I want you to do the same thing. I'm going to expose the next stimulus on the screen for 3 seconds, and I want you to look at it, I want you to register it, and then I want you to write down what you saw. Okay. All right, you got it? Okay, so this is what you saw first. And this is what you saw afterwards. If I was a betting person, which I am not, I would bet that more of you got this than got this. What did I do? First of all, I made a change in the presentation, right? The first thing that I did here, I asked you to register 12 bits of information, to hold that information in your short-term memory, and then to remember what was in your short-term memory. That's what I asked you to do. So there are 12 bits of information here, and you had to look at each letter, remember these letters in order, and then write them down. What I did here is I did several things. First of all, I chunked those bits of information. I separated them. So effectively now what you need to learn and remember are 4 chunks. So I've reduced the number of bits of information that you need to register, retain, and then remember. In addition, I have made these meaningful, right? So all of these, each of these 3 letters in our society have a certain meaning. So I hope you experienced how chunking, how learning and remembering, how chunking facilitates learning and remembering, how adding meaning facilitates learning and remembering, how much easier it is if you were looking at this and you actually said this acoustically to yourself, NFL, CBS, IRA, maybe it already occurred to you that these are meaningful and you were able to chunk on your own, right? Because you're going to be recoding each of these symbols into sounds, NFL, CBS, IRA, MTV, you might have already chunked. But effectively, when you think about experiments where we're trying to look at capacity or memory span, when we are able to reduce the number of bits of information that we need to register and then retrieve, especially if those are meaningful, retrieval, both registration and retrieval will be facilitated. Okay. All right. So here is an illustration of that modal model, Atkinson and Shiffrin, that we've been talking about. You're thinking here about information coming in. Here is the information. It comes in through my senses. I pay attention to it because I know that you want me to make sure that I give this phone number to my husband. So I'm going to pay attention to it. I am going to rehearse it, to hold it in my short-term memory until I am able to write it down. And then when I get it to my long-term storage, maybe you could see that I have Sue's phone number somewhere, and it's in the context, in a meaningful context. Maybe I have it like I would have it maybe in my telephone book back in the day when we had such things like, or black telephone books, right? So I'd have Sam's number, Seth's number, Sue's number, where all of my phone numbers are arranged by name alphabetically. So that's pretty much how that modal model works. And effectively, you notice that an important component of the modal model is that rehearsal, right? So I want to say a few things about long-term memory before I talk about some actual case study data. So in terms of the modal model, short-term memory and long-term memory, we conceptualize those as separate memory stores. And when we think about the types of long-term memory, cognitive psychologists have distinguished between declarative memory, explicit or declarative memory, and implicit or non-declarative memory. So when you think about declarative memory, you're thinking about that knowledge that we can access consciously, whether you're thinking about my personal knowledge, my knowledge about the world. And declarative memory can be further subdivided into episodic memory as well as semantic memory. Episodic memory being my autobiographical memories, semantic memory, knowledge of basic facts. So when you think about intelligence tests, for example, many intelligence tests will have an important semantic memory component because we're looking at knowledge of basic facts. And then when you look at implicit or non-declarative memory, you're thinking about knowledge to which we do not have conscious access. You're thinking about motor skills, cognitive skills. Really, you're thinking about procedural knowledge. When I get in my car and I drive, for example, some of that is relatively automatic. Those are simple learned behaviors. So when we think about long-term memory, think about some of the tests that you know that assess memory and what components of long-term memory do they assess. So we've been talking so far about Atkinson's and Shiffrin's modal model of memory, and certainly there is evidence in favor of the modal model of memory. And the serial order position effect provides support for the modal model of memory, where Atkinson and Shiffrin distinguished between short-term memory and long-term memory. And this serial order position effect is often observed when we look at list learning. So a lot of tests of memory would include list learning tasks. How well can you learn and remember a list of words that are theoretically unrelated? And so the serial order position effect effectively posits that some people are able to remember the words at the beginning of the list. They're better able to recall the words at the beginning of the list. That would be the primacy effect. Some are better able to recall the words at the end of the list, a recency effect. And the primacy effect is thought to reflect short-term memory. the recency effect is thought to reflect long-term memory, which again would be supportive of Atkinson's and Shiffrin's short-term and long-term memory store. But there's also a lot of evidence against the modal model. So although although their model held widespread appeal for decades, I think there is now theoretical and experimental evidence against the modal model of memory. So one of the things that Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed was the importance of rehearsal. Rehearsal was actually key to transferring information from short-term memory to long-term memory. And researchers have found that there are factors other than rehearsal that influence long-term memory. For example, when you think about Crick and Lockhart's research, they talk about the depth of processing, right? The levels of processing model, that if information that is processed at a deep level is more likely to be remembered than information that is processed at a surface level. Gazzaniga and his colleagues reviewed several case studies of patients with brain damage, and the patients were not able to form new short-term memories, yet they were able to form new long-term memories. So again, you think about some of the evidence that kind of contradicts that modal model. And I think what a number of researchers have concluded is that the modal model of memory is oversimplified, in particular when it suggests that there is a separate short-term store and a separate long-term store. I think we're now clear that that is not the case. And especially the work of Baddeley and Hitch really has shown that short-term memory and long-term memory are not unitary stores. So Baddeley and Hitch proposed an alternative model of short-term memory, the working memory model. And if you think about short-term memory, working memory, it is within short-term memory where working memory occurs, right? So when you think about the Baddeley model, you're thinking about certainly that there is information that comes in, whether it's information that is processed through the phonological loop, whether it is information that is processed through the visual spatial sketchpad. So working memory tends to operate as a workspace that will store temporarily, that will store information temporarily, and that will process that information. So auditory, or what I hear, is going to be retained in the phonological loop. What I see is going to be retained in the visual spatial sketchpad. Now, I always think about this again, that some information that we see, I might see, I mentioned the image of the cat. I see the image of the cat, but that information will come in acoustically, right? So that information comes into my phonological loop, even though the initial presentation or the initial registration is through the eye. So effectively, information that I see comes in to the visual spatial and is retained in the visual spatial sketchpad. Information comes in that I hear, or whether I hear you say it or I hear myself say it internally, it's going to come in through my phonological loop. And then the information is encoded differently in the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. Now, the central executive is where all of the information is processed. And in their 2000 work, Baddeley talked about, they added this episodic buffer that is able to combine information from the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad into a single representation. So when you think about what we know about learning and remembering, certainly think about Atkinson's and Shiffrin's work, because I think that is really a model, a structural model that tells us about the process, but also think about what is happening in the brain, that there is not a separate part of the brain where, for example, short-term memories are stored, where long-term memories are stored, but think about this alternative model as an option that helps us to understand how information enters the brain and then how we might operate or work on that information. And when I think about working memory, for example, I think often about Cohen's and Alloway's definition of working memory. It's the information that is held in mind, and from where do I get the information? I might get the information from my environment. I collect it through my eye, through my ear, but I might also get the information from long-term memory. I might need to retrieve the information from long-term memory. So for example, I mentioned a math problem before. I'm getting what you're saying through my ear, but then in order to actually complete the problem, I need to go to my long-term memory to remember the algorithm or the procedure that I need in order to solve the problem, right? So again, the information is coming in from different sources. Now, there's also some neuroanatomical evidence for the working model of memory. So brain imaging studies have revealed that there are distinct neuroanatomical bases for phonological information and for visual spatial information. So the phonological loop activates certain areas in the left hemisphere that are associated with the production of language, so Broca's area and Wernicke's area, for example. Whereas when you think about visual spatial memory, you're thinking about the right hemisphere, a region of the occipital cortex generally associated with visual processing. So I think there is some neuroanatomical evidence for the working memory model of memory, for Baddeley and Hitch's working memory model. So we learn and remember, and then all of a sudden, I come back from the weekend and I seem to have forgotten the information. So why do we forget? That's probably a question that is related to what we've been talking about so far, right? Why do we forget? There are probably two simple answers to the question. Maybe the memory has disappeared. It's no longer available. It's decayed, right? I've replaced it with somebody else. That would be forgetting in short-term memory. You're thinking about the fact that short-term memory can only hold information for a limited period of time unless it is rehearsed. And if I don't rehearse it, it's gonna disappear. It's going to decay. Or maybe displacement theory might be another explanation for why we forget information in short-term memory. And that would be because of its limited capacity, right? So for example, if you've ever given a test like digit span, for example, and as you start to add more and more numbers, sometimes when the child provides an incorrect response, what you find is that the answer to question 7 actually includes some of the numbers that you presented last in question 6. So what happens is that maybe I was able to displace some of the numbers that were part of question 6, but I didn't displace all of the questions. So displacement is because I can only theoretically hold 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information in my short-term memory as an adult. If you want me to hold more, I have to make space for it, right? So I'm going to displace it. And then when you think about forgetting in long-term memory, think about interference, whether proactive interference, whether retroactive interference, whether you're thinking about new memories disrupting old memories, as in retroactive interference, where you think about old memories disrupting new memories, as in proactive interference. Maybe I can't, the information is in my long-term memory store, but I can't find it. I can't retrieve it. Or maybe it never got, maybe I never created, maybe a permanent memory trace was never created in my long-term memory, so that consolidation did not occur. So there are a number of reasons why we would forget. And to tease those out, we can often compare on memory assessments. We can compare performance on the immediate condition of a task to performance on the delayed condition of a task. So there are some commonly used assessments of memory, and I'm just going to mention a few. There are many more. And I pulled this information again from Essentials of School Neuropsychological Assessment, thinking about tests or assessments of memory in terms of whether they are part of a more comprehensive assessment, such as, for example, a measure of cognitive abilities. Memory is one of the cognitive abilities. So if I'm assessing cognitive abilities or intelligence, for example, it is highly likely that there will be memory components embedded in those tests. So you think about memory and different areas of memory, whether you're thinking about immediate memory, whether verbal or visual. So am I able to maintain verbal information in conscious awareness in my short-term memory? Am I able to maintain visual information in conscious awareness? How about retention of information for prolonged periods, whether verbal information or visual information? And then what about verbal visual associative learning? When I see maybe a number, can I quickly say its name, for example? And then working memory is an important component that we need to assess. And the reason for that, of course, is like Dr. Virginia Berninger says, all learning occurs in a working memory environment. So if we are focused on understanding why a student is struggling with learning, it's important for us to understand working memory. And then you're thinking about semantic memory. And this would be your knowledge of basic facts, often referred to as comprehension or knowledge. And I have a number of different tests like the KBC2, the NEPC2, RISC-5, WIPC4, DAS2. These are all tests that are published by Pearson, but certainly there are a number of other examples as well. And you could take a look at those and determine whether or not that particular measure includes information on verbal immediate memory, visual immediate memory, and so on. And then you also have a number of standalone tests. So like the WISC-5, for example, we have a working memory index. We have an auditory working memory index. Over here, we have naming speed, that visual verbal associative learning, symbol translation. We have storage and retrieval. And then we have verbal comprehension, which is really that semantic memory. But there are also a number of standalone tests of memory. We think about, if you think about broadband measures and narrowband measures, like the WISC-5 would be a broadband measure of cognitive abilities. And I'm going to talk now about the RAML-3, the Wide Range Assessment of Memory and Learning, as a narrowband measure of memory. And again, you think about which areas of memory is assessed by all of these different tests, like the RAML, for example, verbal immediate, visual immediate, long-term memory, verbal and visual, and then working memory. So again, depending on the questions that you're trying to answer, you want to select an assessment instrument that'll provide the information that you need. Okay. So let's look at the results of a memory assessment. And I am going to talk about a student, a girl, who is 14 years, 8 months. She is in grade 9. She just started grade 9 at a public high school. Prior to this, she had attended a private Montessori school where she'd earned average grades in kindergarten through 8th grade. In 9th grade, she's failing several classes. She was diagnosed with ADHD, inattentive type, when she was 8 years old. At the time of this assessment, she had been off her medication for a period of time. But the concerns or the referral concerns have to do with forgetting. She forgets to hand in completed assignments. She forgets to bring home needed homework. She often completes the wrong assignments. Again, there's a lot of information that we're thinking here that we need to consider as we're thinking about the assessment. The diagnosis of ADHD, certainly. Am I choosing a measure that will provide information on memory and allow me to determine the impact of any weaknesses in attention on memory? So we used the RAML-3. And the first thing that we look at when we look at the RAML-3 is we want to consider whether or not the results are valid. So the performance validity indicators on the RAML-3 will provide you with that information. Down here, the validity indicator total will describe the child's results either as acceptable or indeterminate or questionable. And for my child, BC, the results are indeterminate. We believe that that is because of attentional weaknesses, which you will see here. I will show you that information here in a second. We believe that she did put forth the effort to complete the tasks, but that the weaknesses in her ability to regulate her attention really impacted her performance. You could see here that indicator 1 has to do with the attention concentration index. Her recognition scores on some of these tasks are pretty good. Okay, so the first thing I want to take a look at is her short-term memory. And so I look first at certainly visual immediate memory, verbal immediate memory, attention, and concentration. These 3 index combine to give you a general immediate memory index, which you could see here is 90, mean is 100, standard deviation 15. You look at visual immediate memory, her composite score is 120. Verbal immediate memory, her score is 88. And then look at her score for attention and concentration. So you're having a high score of 120 on visual immediate memory. The 2 subtests that make up that index, the scale scores, mean of 10, standard deviation 3, appear to be relatively consistent. Similarly, for verbal memory, that index appears to be internally consistent. A 9, scale score of 9 for story memory, scale score of 7 for verbal learning. But you look at the difference between the visual immediate memory and the verbal immediate memory, and you recognize right away that there is a 32-point difference between the two, indicating that she performs more effectively when the input is visual compared to verbal. She's better at registering information in her short-term memory that she takes in through her eye than through her ear, and holding that information in short-term memory, and then showing me either by drawing designs or by telling me or answering verbal questions. But you also notice her relatively low score. Both this appears to be, well, it is a normative weakness. It's a weakness certainly compared to the mean of 100, but it also appears to be a personal weakness, right? Compared to visual immediate memory, for sure. There is a 51-point difference between visual immediate memory and attention concentration. And that difference is significant and unusual, indicating that she struggles to sustain her attention on rote memory tasks compared to other abilities. But you do see some variability in the subtest scores. Finger windows, a scale score of 7, number letter, a scale score of 3. Now, I present these screener memory index scores over here for a reason. You see the screener memory index score is 105. And what's the difference between the screener memory index and the general immediate memory index? This is the difference right here. So general immediate memory includes attention and concentration. The screener memory index does not. Still, you could see the variability between the visual and the verbal here. So we want to recognize that verbal immediate memory appears to be a relative strength, whereas visual immediate memory appears to be a relative weakness. The opposite, right? Visual immediate memory appears to be a relative strength, while verbal immediate memory appears to be a relative weakness. And then we want to think about delayed recall. We know that she's able to register and hold in short-term memory more effectively the visual information. What about the delayed condition, 20 to 30 minutes later, when I ask her to retrieve that information? You see the same pattern, right? You see the visual delayed memory index of 109 compared to the verbal delayed memory index of 79. And then you can calculate an overall general delayed memory index. But again, when you have such variability between the components of general delayed, 109 for visual, 79 for verbal, we want to make sure that we describe this pattern. And then so visual delayed memory, you're really thinking here about a free recall condition, whereas recognition memory in a delayed condition, I am going to provide some cues to your recall, and I'm going to see if you perform more effectively when your recall is cued. And notice that the scores are pretty consistent. Visual recognition memory, 111 compared to 109. Verbal recognition memory, there is some improvement when we cue her recall. That improvement seems to come primarily from the verbal learning recognition. Notice her scale score over here was a 6 compared to a 10 when we cued her recall. That information is important because it helps me to start thinking about what we can do in the classroom to improve her learning. And I've already hypothesized that there are weaknesses and strengths relative to modality, so visual verbal modalities, and I can confirm that by looking at the numbers. So visual immediate compared to verbal immediate, standard score of 120 for visual immediate, 88 for verbal immediate. The 32-point difference is significant statistically. It exceeds the critical value at the 0.05 level. So it is statistically significant. It's also clinically significant. A difference of that magnitude in that direction occurred in only about 2% of our standardization sample. Same thing for delayed, right? You could see that 30-point difference, statistically significant as well as clinically significant. Recognition condition, 17-point difference is not clinically significant, right? So there are some modality specific strengths and weaknesses. You can also look at some of the process scores on the RAML-3. When we look here at her process scores for story memory, you could see her score for story C. Scale score was a 7, story D scale score 11. And here is my gift to you. You wondered why I was talking about verbatim and gist earlier, didn't you? So when we look at her ability to recall verbatim information, scale score of 5, focused on the meaning, she does much better recalling the meaning. And then you can also compare her scores on the 2 stories. Story C, scale score 7, story D, scale score 11. That difference of -4 is significant statistically, also significant clinically. And then what about working memory? Notice her working memory, right? And we talked about, well, attention and concentration are foundational to all aspects of memory, but it's especially important when you're thinking about working memory, because you have to hold the information in your mind. And like I said, that doesn't happen automatically. You have to do something actively to keep it there. You have to rehearse. At the same time, I need to be using the information in order to maybe solve a problem. I maybe need to add, subtract. I need to do things with the information. That's a really complicated process. And you notice her working memory score of 83, her scores for visual working memory and verbal working memory pretty consistent. And then there's an additional subtest here on RAML 3 that doesn't load on working memory, but that does provide some information about working memory, because I'm going to read some sentences. I want you to say exactly what I said. So effectively, in order to repeat, you need to register what I said. You need to hold it in your short-term memory, exactly all of the words in the exact order that I presented, and then you need to say them. So sentence memory really tells us about the information that is held in mind, how you are able to take in that information and hold it there. And you see her scale score of 6. So it seems like she's struggling with verbal memory. She's struggling with working memory. But when you look at retention of information by comparing immediate and delayed conditions, notice that general immediate versus general delayed, visual immediate versus visual delayed, verbal immediate versus verbal delayed, none of these comparisons, the differences are not significant. So it doesn't matter if you're thinking about immediate or delayed, you notice the same pattern. So the results here suggest support a hypothesis of attentional dysregulation, its impact on learning and memory, especially in the verbal processing domain. So what are some things you might be able to do? I included some general strategies to improve memory, like for encoding, focusing attention, ignoring competing stimuli, for retrieval, developing retrieval cues, and so on. So I think just to summarize, we talked about the fact that students must encode information in short-term memory, consolidate the information in long-term memory, retrieve it. If students are struggling, we need to assess memory to understand where the breakdown's occurring at the level of encoding, storage, retrieval, and is it related to all types of information or to maybe one type of information more than other types of information. There are some references included here for you. And then I want to end by telling you that our next webinar is going to be on October 11th. It's going to be assessing memory in college students and young adults. And I included the link where you can find that information. Okay, if you have questions, you can send them to us. Thank you all for helping me with the Q&A box, and I am going to thank you for attending and turn it back to Sherry.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Maccow, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to all of our Q&A monitors for all of your help. Thank all of you for participation. Please leave your browser open as an action item list will pop up, and look for your certificate in your email within the next 2 weeks. Have a wonderful day, and this does conclude our webinar. Thanks, everyone.